Okay, as I mentioned before, we will be starting fairly quickly here, but we still have people signing in and are a little bit uncertain as to what to expect for numbers tonight because of nice weather in most of the state, although some of us in northern Wisconsin are probably thinking about bringing plants in overnight because of potential frost pockets tomorrow night for sure. Hopefully, nobody has peppers, eggplants, maybe even tomatoes and a few other things out in the garden too much yet. Otherwise, you're going to be doing some covering and some uh, other ways to maybe increase the hot air content. And being that it's not an election year, we don't have quite as much hot air as normal in the floating around. Okay, well, last call, I guess, for the intro poll. If you want to answer those two questions, we'll give everybody else or everybody another 20 to 30 seconds to finish off that and for anybody else to join in with us. And then we are going to get started with the first. We're actually going to have three different presentations of sorts this evening. We're going to be starting off with three personnel from the Wisconsin Department of Ag, Trade, and Consumer Protection, and then be transitioning to Ron Keene, and then I will be finishing off with a short discussion on marketing and pricing stuff. So I'm going to end the polling on this. For those of you who are interested, here are the results from the, what was it, nine people that answered the poll question. So a little bit of range in pricing, but basically in that $2 to $4 range, but just outside of that with one. And then on the meat bird price, little bit higher pricing there, with 2 in the $3 ranges and 3 in the $5 plus ranges. So again, just something for us to kind of get started with and get some introductory information. So without further ado, again, most of you have joined in with one or more of the sessions already, but I'm Scott Royce, the talking voice that you hear, because with my bandwidth issues, I don't start the video at all here. But we're going to be turning it over right away to the Wisconsin Department of Ag, Trade, and Consumer Protection. We are blessed to be joined by three personnel from their department to talk about their department's approach to managing selling of meat and eggs from poultry products. So Paul Pierce, and Michael Pedersen, I believe, I hopefully said that correctly. And I believe Paul Humphrey is going to be starting off.
All right, well, thank you, Scott, and thanks, Ron, for the invitation here tonight. So as Scott indicated, my name is Paul Humphrey. I'm the director of the Meat and Poultry Businesses Bureau at DATCAP. And interestingly enough, I grew up on a farm near Ixonia and raised livestock there and exhibited chickens for many years and did on-farm processing as well. And went to University of Wisconsin-Madison for animal science, where I had Ron Keene for some courses, I believe, back several years ago now. So when I got Ron's invitation, I was very excited to join this group here tonight. So if you could advance to the next slide, please. So I'm joined here tonight by Paul Pierce. He's the regulatory section manager in the Bureau of Meat and Poultry Businesses, and also Mike Pedersen. He's a food and dairy sanitarian, also a multiple products grader, means he grades cheese, butter, and eggs as well, with the Bureau of Food and Recreational Businesses. And so these two gentlemen will be going through the slides with you tonight in their respective areas. So thanks for coming on for the webinar tonight.
Next slide, please. So I'm going to be talking through what we look at and how we assess what licenses are needed. And I'm going to start out with less than 1,000 birds sold annually. And these are sales directly from the farm. And if that's the case, producers, as a producer, you can slaughter and sell up to 1,000 birds without inspection or without license for your premise. The sales can only be directly to the consumer. So somebody that comes to your farm from that premise, to your premise, I mean, or through a producer's, you might be a part of a CSA, community supported agricultural business. You can sell them through that also. The important part about this is that the birds must be labeled with the producer's name. So it would be your name and address, and the words "not inspected." That gives the people the understanding that it didn't go through a normal inspection process, but you produced it and you're selling it directly to them. You can also take them to a licensed custom meat establishment, and then they would put their label on it with the name of their establishment, and again, not inspected. Next slide, please. Okay, so this one again is talking about the 1,000 birds sold annually, or less than 1,000 birds. But these are sold at a farmer's market, and I'm sure several of you probably are doing this now. The important part, again, with this one is that it needs to be slaughtered at a state or a federally inspected meat establishment, and that it must be done under inspection. So you're going to find out that it's going to be fully labeled with all the requirements, the features of a label, including the inspection legend. And that's how we disseminate between the inspected and not inspected when we have the not inspected or that we have the legend. So the mobile retail food establishment license is also going to be required at a farmer's market. And you can contact the TCP or the department, the county department where you're working at, the local health department, and they provide that license where the farmer's market is located for further direction. So now I'm going to transition a little bit. On the farm storage is used between farmers market sales dates. A food warehouse license may be needed. So you want to keep that in mind too. Depends on how you hold them and how you transport them. You're going to see that there might be another license or a registration required. Next slide, please. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit of a larger scale, and it might still be less than 1,000 birds sold annually, but you're actually going to sell them to somebody else who's going to resell them. So maybe it's a local grocery store. Again, maybe somebody at another part of the farmer's market where they're going to sell your product. That is going to also need the state inspection or federal inspection from a meat establishment. It's going to again be fully labeled with all the required features, including that legend. Now it's a little bit different. Now we're going to talk about our registration, a meat distributor registration. Whoops. A meat distributor registration is required if the producer's delivering the finished product. So if you're going to take it out and deliver it to other people, you'll want to be registered, and we're going to have some numbers and places that you can contact to get a hold of the people that would do this. This in cold storage again is intended intended by the producer prior to sale. That food warehouse license is going to be needed. And if retail sales are intended to be conducted where the inspected poultry, a retail food establishment license is going to be required too. So it depends on where you're going to take them to, how they're going to sell them. This is all a part of what we provide as a service through the department. Next slide, please. So the requirements for selling poultry greater than 1,000 birds sold annually. At this point, whether it's retail or wholesale, all the poultry and poultry products must be derived from poultry slaughtered and processed at a state or federal inspected meat establishment. And this is, again, it has to be fully labeled with all the required features, including the inspection legend. So we're just kind of, what we're doing is we're going through each of the individual ones and talking about if you're doing a direct sale or not, and how you would get the right requirements. So next slide, please. So just touching on now the sales location from the producer's premise, a retail food establishment license, a door-to-door sales in farmers market, a mobile retail food establishment license, restaurant, grocery store, food cooperatives, other wholesalers. You're going to need a meat distributors if you're going to take it in between. And cold storage prior to sale, you're going to need a food warehouse license. If there's no retail food establishment license, it's held. So next slide, please. Now, what you're seeing now is both the email address and a phone number for retail, mobile retail, or food warehouse license. And the second one is the meat establishment or the meat distributor's license. We didn't really touch on that, but if you're interested in a license to do slaughter and processing for other people, that would be a meat or a meat license that you'd get through our department. So, all right. I think we're up to Michael.
Okay, like stated earlier, my name is Mike Peterson. I'm from the Department of Agriculture, and I take care of the egg licensing as far as food processors. And we get a lot of questions on these every year, from especially from smaller producers, what is needed when you're licensed or who needs to be licensed. So basically, for a grower with fewer than 150 birds, you are exempt from a license. But a nest run registration is a requirement. This is done through the animal health, so that in case of the avian flu or any diseases like that, we have registered flocks that we can trace. If you have a small producer, sales must be directly to the consumers, not to wholesale or distributor. Direct consumer sales include producers' premises, farmers markets within the state, or an egg sales route. For sales at farmers markets, mobile retail license is required. So this is, I believe, is like a $40 fee for this license. Eggs must be kept at an ambient temperature, no greater at 41 degrees. So one of the questions I get is, I have 50 birds. I want to sell to a quick trip store. Anytime you wholesale eggs into a retail market, regardless of the size of your flock, you are required to have a food processor's license. This is a confusing point to some people, but because of the food code states that eggs must be purchased from a licensed source. So I have a lot of producers that have 50 or 75 birds that they want to sell to the local corner store to get their product out there. Those people do need a food processor's license. Next slide, please. For growers of less than 150 birds, cartons must be labeled to follow them, similar to what the meat birds need to be. Producer's name and address, date the eggs were packed, and a carton with a 30 days of pack date, which must be sold or a sell-by date. So if they were packaged on June 1st, there must be a 30-day sell-by date of July 1st. Again, statements must indicate the eggs are packaged, ungraded, and uninspected. Next slide, please. For growers greater than 150 birds, a food processor's license is needed. Generally, producers with more than 150 birds have a food processor's license, and these vary from very small places. I've seen small buildings, in-home processors, all the way to, I believe my largest flock is 3.5 million birds. So obviously there's a wide variety of types of processors that you can have. Eggs must be kept at an ambient temperature, no greater than 45 degrees during storage. That's at the processor's level or warehouse. Eggs must be kept at an ambient temperature, no greater than 41 degrees at retail. So there is a little discrepancy there on the storage temperatures. Basically, the lower temperature is from the food code because of the retail store. Okay, so we got some artists on here, huh? Okay, next slide, please. Okay. Licensing, wholesale eggs off the farm is a food processors plant activity. If eggs are sold at farmers market, both food processors plant and egg licensing mobile retail license are required. If the food processing establishment is receiving unprocessed eggs from local farmers, like Nest Run products, they must be registered with the USDA and register for the USDA shell egg surveillance program and license as a grading station. So if there's a small producer, we see a few of these that will collect eggs from a couple different farms. They take care of the labeling and grading. At that point, that producer or that packager must be licensed with the USDA as a grading station. There's no fee for that registration, but an inspector like myself would have to come quarterly to inspect the product. We have a lot of small grading stations in places like, especially in northern Wisconsin, country stores, stuff like that, that people, they have a couple or three small producers that bring their eggs in. The eggs are processed at the store and sold on the site. License exemption, producers that sell eggs from their own flocks direct to consumer processing. That's a misnomer there. You would have to have a food processor's license if you're over 150 birds. Producers selling nest run eggs strictly to a processor would not need a license. Nest run eggs is, we have several farms in Wisconsin that have between 10,000 and 50,000 birds on premise, but they sell their eggs to a place like Reedsburg Egg or another processor that actually does the packaging and grading. There is no license that is required for that. Next slide, please. Okay, food processing plant license, basic standards for that. You need an annual safe water test, a separate processing or packing room. Basically, you can't package eggs out of your kitchen. If you are a very small processor, I've seen egg rooms in the basement or a separate room or a separate building on the farm. Need at least a 2-compartment sink. Toilet facilities. Cooling and packaging are required at ambient temperature 45 degrees. So we discussed that earlier. Egg washing, eggs must be cleaned. As far as egg washing goes, if they are collected clean, and I've seen a lot of small places do this, like from nest boxes like that, only the dirty ones need to be actually washed, but eggs, it does state in the regulations they need to be clean. Eggs are usually candled, eliminate the cracks or dirty or bloods, any type of a defective egg. There must be labeled with egg quality standards. Those standards are in our regulations as far as the grade A large, extra large. Cartons must be clean and labeled like we discussed earlier. Next slide, please. Okay, these are for large scale processors. Eggs sold at farmers market, both egg processing plant license and mobile retail license, food establishments are required. If the processing establishment receives unprocessed eggs from local farms, Nest Run, like we said before, the processor must be registered with the USDA and under the shell egg surveillance program. Next slide, please. This looks like we went over this once before. Next slide, please. Okay. These are the licensing outlets that you could call or email, and they will basically get you in touch with myself. And if we have any questions, feel free to ask any of those, and we'll try to correct anything that we or answer anything that we have. So thank you.
Okay, does anybody have any questions for our DATCAP personnel in case they have to head out before we get to the overall end of our program this evening? You can either type your questions into the chat, or we have a small enough group. If you want to unmute yourself, you can do that as well. While you're thinking about questions, I am going to pop up another poll. And this is one that, again, some of you have seen if you've been involved in our other one, any of the other events in this series, or any other extension webinars for that matter. But this is our demographics poll, and this is something that we need to do because we are recipients of USDA funding. There is the option of selecting prefer not to respond to any of the questions that are here, but we would appreciate it if you would take a moment while we get into some questions here. Dave asked about what is the typical time frame to receive a license, and is there a specific process for a small flock? I'm assuming that's egg production.
For egg processing?
Yeah.
Yeah. So typically what they do is you contact licensing. They'll send you out a package or a packet of materials that kind of going over the stuff we just talked about, and they'll probably send your application, or they'll send it to one of our agents. Right now, I'm the only agent in the state of Wisconsin. So if you apply for a license, you'll be sent to me. At that point, I will contact you, ask if you have any questions. Actually, you can ask the licensing people also that they will give you my name and number and email address, and you can contact me directly. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to happy to answer for them. But if you make the criteria, we do try to license people as quickly as we can. So it's pretty much up to a person that's has a processing facility. They do need a water sample, clean area to process their eggs, and meet the criteria as far as storage temperatures and so forth like that. Basically, it's just as quickly as that person can get ready.
Okay. Another one came in regarding eggs. For small scale egg producers, can egg cartons be reused from eggs purchased at the store if the proper producer information is present on the package?
Yes, they can. Only criteria on that a lot of the information is supposed to be blocked out. If you get them from Century Foods or whatever, the end panel usually has a pack date and a sell-by date. That must be blocked out completely. If the eggs are ungraded, if they're not grade A large, or jumbo eggs, if they're selling them as ungraded, that must be blocked out. And usually what people do is have a computer generated label that with their information on there and stick it on it. Now, an ungraded egg is a egg that they're not categorized size for. So if you are a small producer, and a lot of these guys do this, most of your eggs are going to be grade A large or extra large, but you don't want to state a size. Basically, all you put on there is ungraded eggs. That's basically saying you're not stating a size.
Okay. This one is for, I'm assuming again for eggs. Is the form for the various licenses, are those forms available online, or do producers need to contact one of you directly?
Yes, if you go on the website, they are available online. I recommend that you email one of the, if you email that site, one of the licensing agents will contact you with some of the material that you need, and then get that right out to you. But yes, you can apply online.
Mm-hmm. And for the small flocks to sell at a farmer's market, the only one that they need is, well, beside the nest run egg producer license, is the mobile retail license, correct?
The nest run is not a license per se, it's a
Correct.
registration.
Yep. Sorry.
No, that's
Wrong
fine.
term.
That's okay. But all I would need is if you're under 150 birds and just sell to farmers markets or on-site sales or egg routes, a mobile retail license is all you need.
Mhm.
You still need to make the requirements as far as the labeling and so forth of your product, though.
Yes. Yep. And the mobile retail license is only for the egg routes. Is that does that mobile retail license required for those as well, or is that just if they're selling at a farmer's market?
No, a mobile retail license covers egg routes. The only time you wouldn't need a mobile retail license is if you just have on-site sales.
Okay.
If you just sell out of your premise or whatever, there's no license required for that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. A common question I get from people hasn't been put in here yet, but if they, okay, a classic example is they go to church. Can they deliver eggs when they go to church, or is that considered an egg route? And then they would technically need the mobile retail license.
Well, I'm an old school inspector, so I call that a judgment call. Let's put it that way. I'm not going to hunt you down if you're taking eggs to Aunt Irma and church and stuff like that. You know, we got to use our heads on some of this stuff, but no, that's more or less if you're going to Madison, Verona, and so forth like that. There's towns around and deliver them. That's where the mobile retail license comes in.
Okay. Question came in: how do these licenses coincide with being a Wisconsin tested flock?
I'm not really sure on that. That might be an animal health question.
Okay.
I know the registration's got to do with animal health as far as registering the flock, because a few years back we did have a pretty good outbreak of the avian flu, which was a real issue in Wisconsin here.
Yep. Yeah, to my knowledge, both they're separate processes. So if you do any sales, you need to have the proper licenses that which allow you to do the type of sales that you do. So if you're a tested flock, that's a separate process. At least that's been my understanding.
Now, what do you mean by a tested flock?
Well, if Paul or Ron want to hop in here too, because I may be saying the terms incorrectly.
It'd be for Polorm, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I started my career as an animal health inspector, and so I was inspecting chicken hatcheries at the time, and yes, it'll be for Polorm testing.
Okay, because there is a stipulation. We didn't have this in our regulations here because it dealt with more larger flocks. But if you have a flock of 3,000 or more, you must be registered with the FDA, and the flock must be tested with the FDA. You have to follow protocols for the SE program, but that's a whole other gambit of regulations. So forth. That is for the larger flocks, 3,000 birds or more.
In that SE, Michael, that's salmonella, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, the flock you have to prove it came from a SE-free flock or breeder flock. There's regulations as far as people coming on site, and this goes for the people that are just nest run if they're over that 3,000 bird mark. So this applies for everyone. It's not a license, but it's a registration through the FDA. And this, I think, is usually done through animal health also, I believe.
Okay. Any other questions? We did have a question come in about premise ID, and that is everyone needs a premise ID if they have livestock, but you still then also need to have the nest run registration or the other licensing. Having a premise ID does not replace the nest run registration process. Okay, last call for at least current questions. Hopefully one of or most more of them will be able to stick around until we get to the end. But otherwise, we'll go ahead and transition to Ron's presentation. Dave did just pop in one more question. As far as for the nest run registration, do you get anything back for that because it's just a registration process? How do you get, I guess, how do you get confirmation that you are registered? Do you get an actual piece of paper for it, or what does DATCAP send back?
You're talking to me?
Yeah.
There's not really I believe that's again registered through animal health. Unless there's an actual license, I really don't deal with that. I'll give you a typical example. I live in southwest Wisconsin. We have a lot of Amish flocks down here. There's 6,000 to 10,000 birds. Those are nest run operations. They have a cooler, and eggs are picked up by a processor in Illinois that does the processing there. So I don't really get onto those places, but they are registered, I believe, through animal health as a nest run because they're over the 3,000 bird mark. They have to be registered with the FDA and follow the protocols that they list. But this again, I don't handle the FDA registration. That's a completely separate type of registration.
I have one quick question for Paul, and I've heard this kind of thrown around. It's 1,000 birds per premise for the year, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's based on the premise, not based on the number of family members.
That's what I've kind of heard people claiming, and I suspected that wasn't true.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we will go ahead and get into the management side of things then. Our next presenter is Ron Keene. If you've been here for one of the other events, you've heard him as well, but he's going to be focusing on money-saving considerations when we're looking at poultry production. And we'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, that was really interesting about those rules. So I'm glad we got that. So I'm going to talk a little bit here about some potential ways to save money when you're producing birds for meat or eggs. I've kind of touched on some of these in the past 2 weeks, so maybe you've heard some of them before, but I'll talk about them where I think it's important. And hopefully won't spend too much time here. But key point, and I think Scott is going to talk about this in his, so I won't go deep into it, but there is this calculator that one of our, was a county agent, now he's an area director, put together, and I think it's pretty good. And again, Scott will show you some more information on that, but it's just a nice Excel spreadsheet of calculating your costs. I would just add to that, I really encourage you to keep records and know what your costs are. I think a lot of times we think, oh, well, I sold these eggs and I got some cash at the end and really don't know where we are. So, but again, I'll let Scott go into that a little deeper. And I've kind of listed here just an idea of what your costs might be. And I'm not going to go through every one of these. I've picked out a couple where I think it's worth commenting on. I think one of the things when you start adding up all these costs, and I talk about this with a lot of the urban producers, you're really never going to make up your costs if you include your capital. If you've got 4 hens and you're charging the cost of the coop, you're never going to make that up. But at least it's good to have these costs and see what you can do with them. So, and one that I want to talk about first, and just a little bit, is this idea of your time and your labor. Because I think too often we get into the idea that our labor is free. You know, and maybe it is if it's something you enjoy doing. If you're going to enjoy raising the chickens, then that's good. But you know, processing chickens especially is not my idea of a fun weekend. But still, I think we need to think about that and think about, you know, the time and the labor, and hopefully it'll pay back enough to cover some of that. Kind of along with that is this opportunity.
Ron, you got muted accidentally here, so sorry. Ron, you're muted. The button got hit accidentally here.
Oh,
so
okay. How about that?
Yep. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So again, I think it's just something to keep in mind that maybe we could, if you're looking at this from a profit potential, maybe you could do something else and make more money. Again, that's not all what we're in it for. So if you enjoy it, that's a different thing. Just a little bit on chick costs, and I would say there's not a lot you can do about this if you're buying small numbers. You know, maybe if you get into buying a couple hundred broiler chicks at a time, you can get a better price on them, things like that. One thing I would point out, and you're going to hear me kind of harp on this a bit, is really, I think it's important to look at the production ability, and maybe it's better to pay a little bit more for the chicks if they are the top producing chicks. Because the chick cost is usually a small part of your total, and if it'll save on feed or growth and things like that, it may be better to spend a little more. Not to go too deep into this, but if you've seen, this has been in the news recently where Tyson had issues with this, where they tried to pick the birds that had the best growing ability, and they found out they didn't breed very well. But that's a different story. But it kind of shows you where you can pick different chicks for different things. The idea of hatching your own, again, I think many cases it'll probably cost you more in the long run than buying good chicks. But potentially, especially with egg producers, you might be able to do some of this and produce your own. The next thing, and I'm going to spend probably the bulk of my time talking about feed and savings on feed, because really feed tends to be, you know, we usually say 60 to 70% of the cost of raising poultry. With feed prices this year, I would guess it may be more than that. They're going to be high. Corn and soybeans are high, and so it's going to be expensive. So I think things to consider, and I kind of lumped them into three different sections. One, decrease the amount of feed the birds are eating. Feed them a cheaper diet or lower the cost, and then really decrease waste. And that's certainly one that you want to work on, because we don't want to just be throwing feed away, right? So I'll talk about each of these a little bit. In the first one, the idea of cutting back on the amount of feed the birds eat. There may be some ways you can do this, and I think some are better than others. A lot of people, and this is probably more toward the meat birds, a lot of people will try to restrict the feed that they give them. And part of that is to cut back on feed, but a lot of it is to slow down their growth. A lot of people with small flocks want them to grow a little more slowly, maybe develop a little better legs and move around a little more. Probably in the long run, this isn't going to change their total consumption very much. They're probably still going to eat about the same amount of feed, just spread it out over more days. Might even increase it slightly because there's some maintenance feed in there as well. Okay, but that's one that people will look at. The next one is where I think you can really make some gains, and I talked about this 2 weeks ago, but I'll mention it again. Feed efficiency. It's sort of like driving a car that gets 30 miles to the gallon versus one that gets 15 miles to the gallon, right? That's where we're looking at how well does that bird produce meat for a certain amount of feed, okay? And I've got some numbers to show you, and this looks a little crazy, but I'll explain it. And these are some pretty wide gaps in feed efficiency, but it shows the point. So if you have broilers that are eating 2 pounds of feed for each pound of gain they produce, and you grow them to 4.5 pounds, they take about 9 pounds of feed per bird, okay? If that bumps up to 2.5 pounds feed efficiency for every pound of gain, you can see here that bird eats an extra 2.25 pounds of feed there, which maybe isn't much. But now if you're going to raise 100 birds, that's 225 pounds of feed that you could have saved. If you go to 1,000, obviously that's 2,200 pounds. So, you know, a ton of feed there, literally. It gets even bigger as you grow these birds bigger. Okay, so if you're talking about raising them up to 12 pounds, which I don't really suggest, but some people do, you know, look, going from 2.5 to 3 on a feed efficiency, again, you can save 600 pounds on those 100 birds. Okay, and part of this goes to what I was talking about, waste. Again, part of it's the efficiency of the bird. Part of it is if that feed gets dumped on the ground or something. So really, I think something to think about with feed efficiency. And this is kind of a second part of this puzzle. This is a little bit old, but the chart is still pretty good. And this is how feed efficiency gets poorer as the birds get older. Okay, so we go from 1 week of age, which you wouldn't want to process there, but they have very efficient growth there, almost 1-to-1, out to, you know, 10 weeks of age. We're up here, you know, 2.5 or so. So the point of this is that one way to save and make them more efficient is to process them at a younger age, which I think I have in the next slide. Okay, so I think that's something to think about. Now, processing at a younger age, there's some trade-offs. Okay, yes, you get more feed efficiency typically, so your pounds of feed per pound of bird will be better. Okay, if the people you're selling to want more of a roaster type, more of a, you know, 8-9 pound bird, then you probably need to grow to that. Okay, along with that, age can change the bird a bit. So as the bird gets older, they tend to put on more fat. Their meat tends to get a little bit more dense, less tender. And so again, you kind of have to figure out what markets you're looking at and decide where to go with that. But that's one way I think you can save, is by processing them when they're more efficient. This just gives you some idea. I looked these up for this. Cobb is a pretty common one that's used in the US. Their growth expectation is 5 pounds at 35 days, 8 pounds at 7 weeks, and 10.5 by 9 weeks. They may not quite grow that fast depending on your setup, but that's a good thing to aim for. So those are some things with sort of decreasing the amount of feed, lowering the cost. You know, if you can buy bulk, if you're raising enough birds that you can buy in bulk, you can probably save a bit there. I wouldn't try to have the feed around more than, say, you know, 6 weeks or 2 months at most. So if you can't use that much, then it's probably not going to save you. As the birds get older, if you've got access to grain, you can do some, and this is meat birds, but you can do this with layers as well, offering grain-free choice and sort of let them choose how much grain they want to eat versus how much of the commercial ration. And that can save you a bit. You know, I put in here local alternatives. I always get a little frustrated when I see these talks where somebody, well, I happen to live next door to a feed mill, so I get all this feed really cheap. Well, that's a pretty slim number of us that live next door to a feed mill. But if there are things that are available, you know, maybe you can get bakery scraps from someone, or you can get things from the grocery store, the vegetables that are out, things like that. So certainly those are things to think about if they're available, and that can save a little bit. And I mentioned here forage and pasture, and I've put this on in other weeks, and I think I maybe came across that I'm not in favor of this, and that's not really true. I do think it's very good. I do question some of the statements about how much feed you can save, that I think generally they're going to, a lot of that plant material isn't necessarily going to provide, you know, protein or energy, so it won't save a whole lot, but certainly it can be helpful, provide them a lot of different products. Okay. So those are some things that maybe can help, you know, cut down that feed bill a bit. And then decreasing waste. And I think these are some that most of us can do. And really, again, you hate to see feed just getting dumped on the ground or thrown away. So keeping your feeders, you know, at proper height where the bird can't get in them and scratch stuff out. Usually it's sort of the top of the back is good so that they have to reach a little bit to eat. Don't overfill the feeders. I've seen this where, well, I don't want to have to go out as often, so I just fill them really heaping full, and then, you know, a lot of it gets wasted. So that's something you'd like to avoid. Grates over the feed. If you can get a feeder with, say, some chicken wire over the top or something, make the birds work a little bit to pick that feed out. And again, they can't scoop it out with their beak or scratch it out. Don't have it getting rained on, things like that. Rodents and wild birds, again, we'd like to prevent them from a biosecurity standpoint, but they also can eat a fair amount of feed if you've got, you know, a few of them. So that can be one. And then non-productive chickens, and this might seem a little cruel, but if you've got a bird that can't walk or it's a runt and not growing, there's a good chance it's never going to really get to the processing plant or your processing area or lay many eggs. So you may want to think about, you know, getting rid of those. So those are all kind of feed related things. Some others, and I'll go fairly quickly through some of this, but I think it's really disgusting to raise a bird up and then have something else eat it, like a raccoon or a coyote or something like that. So again, things that you can do to limit mortality, and I won't go over all of these, but that can be definitely a savings to not have, you know, feed the wildlife. Again, health, the same thing. And I've talked about some of this in the other talks. If you missed those, apologize. But again, there's a few things you can feed. Medicated feed that you see here, if that's something you want to consider, that's usually for this coccidiosis. Marek's disease is one that I would suggest vaccinating if you're buying chicks from the hatchery. There's not a whole lot of other vaccines that are typically available. And good biosecurity, and again, I won't pound on biosecurity again tonight, but you've all heard it, I'm sure. But, you know, again, buy clean stock, use clean equipment, don't bring in diseases. People tend to be one of the biggest carriers of disease, so, you know, change shoes, wash your clothes, things like that, if you've been around other birds. keeping wild birds and other animals out again. That's important from a disease standpoint as well. A couple other things, and then I do have some layer things here I'll get to pretty quickly. Again, you're producing a food product, so you really want to make sure you're using approved products, approved medications, etc. if you're using any. It's hard to come by any of these without a vet prescription these days, which is not a terrible thing, I think. But again, even if you do get a prescription, follow the instructions, follow withdrawal periods, things like that. Food safety, I don't think that's so much a money savings thing, but it's just good practice if you're processing your own at home, especially, you need to follow these things. So that's real quick, some things with the meat birds, a couple things about layers that I think are some, and again, a lot of those can be effective there as well. Feed efficient birds, if you get commercially selected layer genetics, they're going to probably lay a lot more eggs and they'll be more feed efficient than if you get birds that are not selected for egg production. Again, the feed wastage and the biosecurity, all those things are still valid. One thing that I would suggest you look into if it's an option, and this kind of varies by where you are around the state and your situation, but there are people that grow started pullets. And it was mentioned earlier, some of these producers that have 6,000, 10,000 birds, things like that. A lot of them are buying their pullets from somebody, and they'll, maybe have a couple hundred extra that they'll sell. That's not too unusual. So if you can get those, they're generally really well cared for, nice birds. They've often been vaccinated for a number of diseases, so it kind of takes that out of the question. And so if it's something that's available, you might consider that. Can help with your egg production. Something else, and I touched on this the other talk with the layers, you kind of have to decide if you're in this for a profit margin, and hopefully if you're selling eggs, it might be something there. But the birds are going to decrease in production every year. And generally, after the second year, maybe into the third year, they're probably going to eat more feed than what you'll get back from eggs for them. And so generally at that point, they become pets if you're keeping them. So you kind of have to decide that. But I know a lot of people, if they do have, say, 100 birds or so, they might consider getting 50 one year and then 50 new ones the next year. And then you're just kind of on a rolling turnover after that. And those that are 2 years old, you move out, you bring a new 50 in, and that way you've got some that are 1 year old and some that are 2 years old, and you can kind of roll through. That can be a pretty effective way. You can get good egg size from those second year hens and really good production, and it can be pretty effective. And then last thing I'll talk about is removing non-layers. And again, if these are your pet flock, you may not want to, but it's something that you can do. And if you start looking at the birds and handling them, and you can get to know, you can pick out those that are just eating and not laying eggs, and maybe you want to consider getting them out. And I've put just kind of quickly some things to look at here without some pictures and a little more. This might take you some work, but you can get the idea. So a laying hen typically has a nice red waxy comb. Her feathering might actually be rough, and this seems kind of backward, but generally a hen that's laying really well doesn't tend to produce nice new feathers. Her feathers kind of look ratty because she's putting all her energy into eggs. And if you contrast that to the non-laying hens, a lot of times they have nice new feathering because they'll molt and grow new feathers a lot of times. And so they may look pretty, but not be laying eggs. Likewise, if they have yellow skin, you can look at this a lot. And those that are laying eggs are putting a lot of pigment into the egg yolks. And so they don't have so much to store in their skin. And so they might not look so bright and colorful like those that are not laying. And those that are not laying will have really bright yellow feet around their beak and things like that. So those are things to look at. And then you can handle the birds. The pubic bones, the vent bones are spread out. Usually you can put 2 or 3 fingers between them if they're laying well. If they're not, those are going to be tight, narrow spread, kind of sharp feeling. Likewise, the vent will look moist and soft if they're laying and dry. And sometimes, you know, again, if they're not laying, they tend to accumulate a lot of fat. And so that you can get a sense from. So those are all some things. Oh, I forgot I had winter production in here. Again, winter production, if you are going to produce eggs for sale, you may want to consider artificial lights so that you can keep winter production going. Heat is kind of a questionable one. If they are not provided heat, they'll probably eat more feed, so you can weigh the trade-off there. Again, frozen eggs can be an issue because you can't really sell those or do much with them. And if you do provide heat, they maybe will lay better than if they didn't. Offset that with cost of providing heat and safety. So that's some things. So went pretty quick, but I think those are some things I would suggest thinking about to maybe save some money.
You do have one question in the chat, if you can just look at that. Basically, what options are there for the birds?
Yep. And I think you're going to talk about that probably, but
a little bit, but not a ton.
Yeah, I mean, there are what's called spent hens, you know, or stewing hens, if you will. And so they can be processed they make really good soup. As I mentioned, they add more fat as they get older, and so they'll have a lot more flavor, if you will. They just might not be quite as tender, but yeah, that's an option. You don't want to pay to have processed. Yeah, that's a challenge. You might find some people that will buy them live. You know, Craigslist, things like that. I probably am getting a little off with my rules there. The Department of Ag might have some issues with that. But I think if you're selling them from your farm, you're probably okay with that. So, yeah. Productivity, 65 days. So I think what I'm getting at that is how long, how many years. Sort of a ballpark figure I've heard tossed around is the decrease 20% per year. So if you're getting 220 the first year, you'd cut off, what's 20% of that? 40 eggs off of that. Second year, so you'd be down to 180, and then by the third year you'd be down to, you know, 145, 150. I think I'm doing my math right there. So again, that third year, typically they're probably not going to pay for themselves. They might. The replenishing the flock naturally. I mean, depends on your situation. I would say a lot of times, a lot of the hens won't go broody, depends on your breed. I would encourage you to at least have some sort of an area you can put them separately if they're broody and raise the chicks separately. I've seen a lot of problems when you just let them in with the flock. Silkies will probably brood. That should be fine. The Easter eggers, I would guess a lot of those may not go broody. But,
And if they do, they won't do it where you want them to.
right.
That's guaranteed.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
almost guaranteed.
Yeah.
But yeah, the silky bantams, they are pretty broody. The trick with them is they're broody, but they tend to not be as persistent as they need to be. They tend to seem to like laying for like 26 days instead of 29 or 28 or whatever, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I have had some problems with that occasionally.
Yeah, you can hatch larger eggs under the bantams. That's not a problem. You might not be able to put as many. But,
Yeah, there are some breeds that are known for their broodiness and their ability to mother well too. You know, some of the Cochins are good at that. Some of the good egg layers are better at it than others too. That's one of the reasons we raise black Australorps.
yeah. All right.
Well, if you do have other questions, you're welcome to put them into the chat as we continue here. I am going to finish off the discussion for the evening with a short presentation, keyword short presentation on looking at some pricing and marketing issues. Of course, if I can get the darn thing to... There we go. Is that showing up correctly, Ron? Okay, thank you. Okay, so just a few things then on pricing and marketing of poultry products. I forgot to change well, not my name, but where I work. I'm not in Florence County anymore, and we're not UWEX anymore. I guess I've been around too long. Had too many different position descriptions. But anyway, I do want to give Ron credit for a few of the slides or photos in particular are from him. So I don't want to try to mess that up. So, okay. As Ron mentioned, one of the places that you can get some information about or put in your own information, I really should say, to look at break-even pricing of egg production in particular is what this one is oriented toward. And we're going to look at some other examples on the meat side of life here real quick too. But the website that I have up here is a poultry break-even calculator. It's an Excel file that you can put your own information into and then decide, okay, this is what it costs me. This is what I need to break even to at least get my costs. Now, do I want to make something above that, or, you know, do I just want to break even and look at the animals as kind of the extra opportunity for enjoyment and stuff like that? So there's different ways of looking at it, but this is an Excel file. Again, it's downloadable. You don't need to try to look that up right now. We will be getting the video links to everyone at some point, and we will also be sending out slides as PDF versions. I need to verify that with our DATCAP folks if that's acceptable to do that, so I'll be asking them at some point about that. But Ron and my slides for sure will be getting out to everybody. But this is a screenshot of the actual Excel file that we were just talking about, the one on the Richland County Extension page. And again, it's fairly straightforward. You put in some guesses, maybe if you're on the pullet cost side of it. If you raise them up from chicks, you need to figure out how much it actually costs you to raise them from the chick stage to the stage at which they are starting to lay. But then you can put in all of your various production costs. So it goes through, tries to make you think about all of these different things. And I'm going to be harping on that in a little bit too. So one of the things that a lot of poultry producers forget about is the non-cash costs that they pay. The increase in electricity bill, the increase in transportation costs because they have to run to the feed mill an extra time a week or month or whatever. All of these different things that can add up. Are there opportunity costs is one thing that you also need to think about. I mean, what aren't you doing with your time when you're taking care of your chickens? Is there an actual financial cost to that? So that's something else to think about. It may not be much of a factor for you, but it is something to think of. Again, Ron mentioned it before too when he was talking about it, but trying to think about how much does the capital that you are using for those critters cost you on a per year or per batch basis. And there's many different ways to depreciate outbuildings, and there's no absolute, but I guess my biggest point is make sure that you do charge yourself some of those things. Obviously, the other ones are kind of straightforward, you know, what the chick or the pullet costs. Are you experiencing a death loss? Feed, bedding, brooding, processing, labor, marketing. Those are all things that kind of need to come into play. The one that, again, most of us as smaller producers tend to forget about or not fully account for is that labor cost. And the smaller the operation, the higher the labor cost per unit of production. It's just a matter of fact. And we need to think about those things. We need to put something to the value, an actual charge or a replacement of something else that you would be doing otherwise. So a couple of different scenarios that I just want to show you to, again, kind of help you think about budgeting or cost and how it relates to pricing of situations. The one that you show here is one that I actually received from a working farm that I had permission to use for a different presentation a few years ago. So these are old feed costs, by the way. But it just shows you on a per group cost analysis of producing broilers that when for the feed, butchering or processing, and the purchase of the animal, I believe was in here as well. Yeah, there it is down on the bottom. They only have an $8.57 break-even cost. So if they're raising up, and I believe these, yeah, here they're raising them up to 3 3/4 pound dressed weight. So if they're charging a little over four, theoretically, according to this, they're making over $8 a bird. But the only thing they've paid for is the feed, the processing, and the bird. They haven't paid for anything else. So that gives you one kind of a scenario. But then if you look at some other sources, this is one from North Carolina that I thought was really kind of interesting. It compares conventional feed and then organic certified feed and how much it costs to produce chickens. Here again, we're looking at putting those birds to around 4 pound live weight, so or a little over 4 pound live weight, but 3.6 pound dress weight. So they've got the chicks in here. They've got the farm costs, so in other words, some capital. They're charging themselves for labor. That's a good thing. They have some transportation. They have a processing cost. Now that processing cost might be more than what a lot of people are going to charge themselves for that, but it's probably realistic. They charge themselves for some marketing, and then comes the feed. And here you see when you look at, again, these are 20, I want to say this was by about 30 to 50% compared to what we're paying right now for feed. But you can see a pretty significant difference between the types of feed that you buy and how much it affects the cost of production and then the break even. So if you look down at those last three numbers, if you're feeding conventional feed in this budgeting system, you should be charging $6.50 a pound just to break even. If you're charging organic feed, you need to charge $7.50 a pound. Now, those numbers are radically different than the ones we just looked at, where we were making money at actually right around $2.75 a pound. So you need to think about your true cost of production. That's one of the biggest points. And then the last set of these numbers is some information I looked at on the Penn State site, and this is their website. So they actually have a really good set of enterprise budgets for small poultry flocks. And you can look them up and download them. And these are downloadable, fillable Adobe files. So again, you can put in your information for these and really work with them and fine tune your situation. But they had essentially industry accepted information for Northeast America. And for them, when they had a 100-bird brown egg production farm, their break even was to charge basically $2.67 per dozen eggs. If you cut that in half and you have 50 birds, a 50 bird laying flock and producing brown eggs, you increase your cost of production a full 50 cents, but actually more than that, about 60 cents per dozen. So you go from 267 to 326 on your break-even prices. On the meat bird side of life, if you're raising those broilers up to 5 pound and 100, now these are 100 bird batches, and their budgets that they produced here used 3 turns per year with 2018 feed prices. So again, these numbers from a feed price side of things are definitely going to be cheaper than what we're going to be paying in 2021. But the capital costs get assigned over basically 300 birds a year. Okay, so if you are raising 100 bird batches of corn, okay, sorry about that, everybody. And because I was host, it kicked everybody out. So there is another place that you can get some information that will help you on pricing. And that is one of them. There's actually more than just this one, but one that can work fairly well is the Cornell developed Meat Suite. It is a pricing tool that allows you to put in your data, and then you add in a profit per animal, and then it can help you calculate price per pound. Now, it isn't originally designed for poultry, but it does work as long as you are willing to finagle things a little bit and work around with it. It can work reasonably well. Again, not perfect, but it does work. Okay, so one of the big points of this was to try to help you think about costs, and that there are a lot of higher costs. But the main point is, when you are figuring out how much you are willing or needing to charge, remember that you're not selling a value deflated product. You are actually selling a value added product. We can't compete with the big producers, whether it's on the meat bird side of things or commercial scale egg producers. we can't beat those prices that people can pay in a store if they want to. So instead of trying to do that, sell your stuff, sell your birds, sell your quality, sell your production practices, and don't undersell either. Don't financially, or be overly modest about the way you do things. It is essentially harmful to your own operation as well as to everybody else if you specifically undersell a product to try to be the lowest cost in the neighborhood or something like that. And if you cause problems for yourself, then you're basically causing it for the entire industry, is one way to think about it. So what is marketing in a nutshell? It's the part of your business that allows you to make money. Because it's where you actually sell your product, or it's the primary way that you sell your product. You get to show off your birds, and word of mouth isn't the only way to go, you know. So if you have a multi-enterprise farm, how does your poultry marketing work with your other farm marketing? That's another thing that you need to think about and really kind of pay some attention to. And can they interact well, or do they are they completely separate enterprises because you do your marketing in completely separate ways? So here's kind of some things that a lot of farmers think of when they hear the word marketing. They think of costs, advertising costs, making signage, putting it up, keeping it up, you know, protecting it from the weather, making sure it's legible. I've got to have an extra phone, or I've got to have my phone on me all the time. I spend a lot of time doing this, you know. Or a classic one for that I hear a lot is, I have to actually interact with people. You know, most farmers are doing it because they like the animals, or they like the crops, or they like being in the tractor, not because they like being around people. So try to help people understand why your product costs more than it does in the supermarket. Distinguish your product, you know, sell the story of your farm and your birds' life, you know, that it is different from those larger commercial scale operations. Show how the poultry fits into your life, or the way of life on your farm. If the kids or grandkids are involved in your production, feature that. That's a pretty easy selling point for a lot of families. Think about and really, you know, kind of focus on the differences in taste or texture or consistency that you may have. And again, whether it's eggs or meat, there are
I think we lost Scott again. I guess, are there any other questions? I think it's almost, we've lost most everyone. Okay. Well, I assume Scott will log back in here in a minute or so. Apologize for the technical difficulties. Well, not sure where he was here. Um, We're having some technical difficulties here.
Feels the same way in return. Your thoughts on this, AJ? I think it's great for golf. And by the way, I'm a fan of both. Don't know either of them. Fan of both. I'm absolutely a fan of both of them, and I think this is going to be an amazing rivalry that we're going to get to see play out. Like on Sunday, they're paired up, going back and forth. They seem like they're approaching the game very different. You know, Bryson is the most technical, scientific guy working on every single little thing. And
I think we've got.
I mean, he's even committed to getting bored and losing focus during rounds, like final rounds of PGA. This guy's getting bored and he's losing his focus. That's how awesome he is, how good he can be. So
do we have somebody's radio on? It sounds like, huh?
Guys, they hate each other. Sitting there and watching. I want to see if everything's busy. Well, how about?
All right, I'm not quite sure what's. Well, I think we've lost Scott. Did anybody have any other questions? I could try to pull his stuff up and finish. I think this is where he was talking about some things. I just wanted to mention that there are some other things you might think about selling. You know, non-traditional breeds, parts, fly tying, plumage. We talked about stewing hens. Even selling the manure and bedding can be something worthwhile. Scott's got a lot of other stuff here. So again, sort of your different styles and systems. Selling cut up parts can be something, although that can be an issue with getting rid of the other parts then, but it might work for you. Lots of different opportunities with eggs. You know, he talked about different feeds, different colors of eggs. Selling the small bantam eggs can be fun, and you might get a good market for those. The really dark ones, if you have those breeds. So there's a few different ones. So I apologize for the that, but I think those are some of the things we covered. So. Any quick questions we had? There was a question in the chat about why I suggested not having broody hens with the rest of the flock, and I don't think that person is on anymore, but I guess I would say one of the big problems is keeping them in a nest and not having other hens trying to get in the nest with them. You get broken eggs. I've seen it where the hens will continue to lay more eggs in the nest, and now you've got eggs of lots of different chicks hatching. Yeah, I know, we got booted a couple times. And now I suspect we only have part of us in the meeting, I'm not sure. So yeah, I don't know what, I think we'll probably call it good here and try to send out the last bit of slides. Is probably what we'll end up doing if nobody has any other questions. So, well, thank you all for your patience. Apologize again for the technical difficulties. So with that, I think have a good night.